The dust of countless marching feet rose like a golden cloud across the plains of Mesopotamia. It was the 1st of October, 331 BCE, and the ancient world was about to witness something extraordinary. Two of history's greatest military minds were converging on a flat expanse of land near the village of Gaugamela, each commanding forces that represented the pinnacle of their civilizations. On one side stood Darius III, the great king of the mighty Achaemenid Empire, ruler of territories stretching from India to Egypt, at the head of what may have been the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. On the other side, a young Macedonian king barely 25 years old, leading a force outnumbered by margins that would terrify any reasonable commander. Yet Alexander of Macedon was far from reasonable. He was a man possessed by dreams of conquest that defied all logic. And on this day, those dreams would either die in the dust of Gaugamela or reshape the known world forever. The morning air was thick with tension as the two armies faced each other across the plain. This was no ordinary battle. This was the collision of civilizations, the moment when East would meet West in a symphony of bronze and steel that would echo through the ages. The stakes could not have been higher. For Darius, defeat meant the end of an empire that had ruled the known world for over 2 centuries. For Alexander, victory would mean the fulfillment of a destiny he believed had been written by the gods themselves. But how had these two men, these two armies, these two worlds, come to this moment of ultimate confrontation? The story begins not on the plains of Gaugamela, but in the marble halls of Pella, where a young prince named Alexander was learning the art of war from the greatest minds of his age. The Achaemenid Empire in 331 BCE was a colossus that bestrode the ancient world like no power before or since. Founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, it had grown through conquest and diplomacy to encompass nearly 3 million square miles of territory. From the sun-baked deserts of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the bustling ports of Ionia to the fertile valleys of Bactria, the Persian Empire was a tapestry of peoples, languages, and cultures united under the rule of the King of Kings. Darius III had inherited this vast realm, but he had also inherited its problems. The empire was simply too large to govern effectively. Rebellion simmered in distant provinces. Satraps, the provincial governors, often acted more like independent kings than loyal subjects. The treasury, once overflowing with tribute from conquered lands, was strained by the costs of maintaining such a massive domain. And now, from the west, came a new threat, unlike any the Persians had faced before. Alexander had already proven himself no ordinary enemy. In 334 BCE, he had crossed the Hellespont with an army of just over 30,000 men, a force that seemed laughably small compared to the resources at Darius's disposal. Yet in battle after battle, this young Macedonian had achieved the impossible. At the Granicus River, he had shattered a Persian army and opened the gates to Asia Minor. At Issus, in one of history's most dramatic reversals, he had defeated Darius himself, forcing the great king to flee the battlefield and abandon his family to Alexander's mercy. The psychological impact of Issus had been devastating for Persian morale. Their invincible king had been humiliated by a barbarian youth from the edges of the civilized world. Cities that had been Persian for generations opened their gates to Alexander without a fight. Tyre, the great island fortress, fell after a siege that demonstrated Alexander's tactical genius. Egypt, the jewel of the Persian crown, welcomed him as a liberator. With each victory, Alexander's legend grew, and with it, the belief that he was truly favored by the gods. But Darius was far from finished. The great king understood that his empire's survival depended on stopping Alexander before the Macedonian could penetrate deeper into the Persian heartland. After Issus, Darius had retreated to Babylon, where he began assembling an army that would dwarf anything he had fielded before. This would not be another hasty response to Alexander's advance. This would be a carefully planned campaign designed to use Persia's greatest advantage, its seemingly inexhaustible manpower. From every corner of the empire, warriors answered the call. The Immortals, the elite guard of the Persian king, marched from Persepolis with their gleaming scale armor and golden spears. From the steppes of Central Asia came Scythian horse archers, masters of mounted warfare whose arrows could darken the sky. Indian war elephants, massive beasts that struck terror into any army that had never faced them, trumpeted their way across the dusty roads to Babylon. Bactrian cavalry, renowned for their skill and courage, rode from the mountains of Afghanistan. Median infantry, descendants of the people who had helped Cyrus build the empire, formed up in their traditional phalanxes. The numbers were staggering. Ancient sources claim Darius assembled over 1 million men, though modern historians believe the true figure was closer to 200,000, still a massive force by ancient standards. What mattered was not the exact number, but the psychological impact of such a host. This was an army drawn from every nation under Persian rule, a demonstration of the empire's power and reach. Surely no force on earth could stand against such overwhelming numbers. Darius chose his battleground carefully. Unlike at Issus, where the narrow coastal plain had prevented him from using his numerical advantage, the great king selected the plains near Gaugamela specifically because they offered the room his massive army needed to deploy. The ground was flat and open, perfect for his cavalry and chariots. He even had the battlefield prepared, leveling rough patches and clearing obstacles that might hinder his forces. This time, there would be no surprises, no tactical tricks that could offset his overwhelming superiority in numbers. Meanwhile, Alexander faced the greatest challenge of his career. His army, though seasoned by years of campaigning, was still vastly outnumbered. Many of his men were growing weary of constant warfare, homesick for Macedonia and the families they had left behind. Some questioned whether their young king's ambitions had finally exceeded his abilities. The Persian Empire was vast, wealthy, and seemingly inexhaustible. Even if they won at Gaugamela, what then? How could 30,000 Macedonians hope to hold down an empire of millions? But Alexander had something that could not be measured in numbers. He had an army that believed in him absolutely. Veterans who had seen him lead from the front in battle after battle, sharing their dangers and their triumphs. He had generals who had grown up with him, men like Hephaestion and Ptolemy who understood his mind and could execute his most complex battle plans. And he had a tactical system, the Macedonian phalanx combined with heavy cavalry, that had proven its superiority time and again. As the two armies converged on Gaugamela, the ancient world held its breath. This was more than a battle between two kings. This was a clash between two ways of life, two visions of how the world should be ordered. The Persian system was based on the rule of one man over many peoples, each maintaining their own customs and traditions under the umbrella of imperial authority. The Greek system, as interpreted by Alexander, was based on the spread of Hellenic culture and values, the creation of a unified world bound together by shared beliefs and practices. The night before the battle, both armies made their final preparations. In the Persian camp, priests performed ancient rituals, calling upon Ahura Mazda to grant victory to the forces of light over darkness. In the Macedonian camp, Alexander consulted the omens and found them favorable. Tomorrow would bring either the fulfillment of his destiny or the end of his dreams of world conquest. As dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela, the very air seemed to tremble with anticipation. The sun climbed slowly above the horizon, casting long shadows across a landscape that would soon be transformed into one of history's greatest battlefields. Both armies stirred to life with the methodical precision of well-oiled war machines, each man knowing that this day would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the known world. In the Persian camp, the scene was one of organized chaos on an almost incomprehensible scale. Darius had arranged his forces with the meticulous care of a master strategist. At the center of his line stood the Immortals, their bronze-scaled armor gleaming like the skin of some mythical dragon. These were the elite of the elite, 10,000 men whose ranks were always kept at full strength, hence their name. Each carried a golden spear, and headed wore the distinctive felt cap that marked them as the personal guard of the great king. To their left and right stretched formations that represented the diversity of the Persian Empire. Medes in their traditional garb stood shoulder to shoulder with Assyrians, whose ancestors had once ruled Mesopotamia. Sasay warriors from the far steppes fingered their composite bows, while Bactrian cavalry checked their weapons one final time. The variety of armor, weapons, and fighting styles was staggering. Yet Darius had welded this polyglot force into a coherent military instrument through years of training and the promise of rich rewards for victory. But the true terror of Darius's army lay not in its infantry. Impressive as they were, the great king had deployed over 200 scythed chariots along his front line, fearsome war machines designed to break enemy formations through sheer shock and carnage. Each chariot was fitted with razor-sharp blades extending from the wheels and axles, turning them into rolling engines of destruction. Behind them waited 15 war elephants, massive beasts whose very presence on a battlefield could cause panic among troops who had never faced such creatures. The Persian cavalry, numbering in the tens of thousands, formed the wings of Darius's formation. These were not the light horse archers of the steppes, but heavy cavalry armed with long lances and protected by mail armor. Many were Persians of noble birth, men who had trained for war from childhood and whose families had served the crown for generations. They sat their horses with quiet confidence, knowing that their charge had broken enemy lines from India to Egypt. Alexander's army, by contrast, seemed almost intimate in its scale. Yet what it lacked in numbers, it more than compensated for in cohesion and experience. The Macedonian phalanx formed the center of his line, a forest of 18-foot sarissas that created an impenetrable hedge of bronze-tipped death. These were the men who had followed Alexander across 2 continents, veterans whose discipline and skill had been forged in the crucible of countless battles. The young king had made several crucial modifications to his traditional formation for this encounter. Knowing he would be vastly outnumbered, Alexander had refused his left wing, pulling it back at an angle to prevent encirclement while concentrating his strength on his right. There, he positioned his Companion Cavalry, the elite heavy horsemen who had charged with him through every major battle of the campaign. These were more than soldiers. They were his friends, his brothers in arms, men who would follow him into the very gates of Hades if he commanded it. Alexander himself would ride with the companions, as was his custom. This was not mere bravado, though his enemies often dismissed it as such. The king understood that in ancient warfare, leadership was intensely personal. His men needed to see him, to know he shared their dangers. More than that, Alexander possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense the crucial moment in battle, the instant when a decisive blow could shatter an entire army. As the morning progressed, both commanders made their final dispositions. Darius positioned himself in the center of his line, surrounded by the immortals and mounted on a towering chariot that made him visible to every man in his army. This was calculated theater as much as military necessity. The great king needed to project strength and confidence to forces drawn from dozens of different peoples and cultures. His presence was the symbol that held this vast coalition together. Alexander, meanwhile, moved constantly along his line, speaking with his officers, encouraging his men, making last-minute adjustments to his formation. He had divided his army into multiple commands, giving each general specific objectives and the authority to adapt to changing circumstances. This was the Macedonian way of war, flexible and responsive, quite different from the more rigid Persian approach. The psychological warfare had already begun. Persian heralds rode forward under banners of truce, offering terms that would have made Alexander ruler of half the known world. He could have Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and vast treasures beyond counting. All he needed to do was acknowledge Persian suzerainty and retreat beyond the Euphrates. It was a generous offer, one that many of Alexander's own officers thought he should consider. But Alexander had not come this far to settle for half measures. His vision encompassed nothing less than the conquest of the entire Persian Empire, the fulfillment of his belief that he was destined to rule the world. The heralds returned to Darius with a simple message. There could be only one king of Asia, and Alexander intended to claim that title on the field of battle. The tension reached its peak as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Both armies were now fully deployed, separated by perhaps half a mile of open ground. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of horses stamping and men checking their equipment one final time. This was the moment every warrior dreaded and craved in equal measure, when all the preparation, all the training, all the courage would be put to the ultimate test. Darius made the first move, signaling his chariots to advance. The ground trembled as 200 war machines rolled forward, their scythe blades glinting in the sun like the wings of some terrible mechanical bird of prey. Behind them, the great king's host began its advance. A tide of humanity stretching from horizon to horizon, banners snapping in the wind, the sound of their war cries echoing across the plain like distant thunder. Alexander watched them come with the calm of a man who had already seen this moment in his dreams. He had spent the night before the battle studying the ground, calculating angles and distances, visualizing exactly how the engagement would unfold. Now, as Darius's army approached, everything was proceeding exactly as he had foreseen. The young Macedonian king raised his hand, and across his compact line, trumpets sang their bronze-throated song. This was the moment Alexander had been preparing for his entire life. Every lesson from Aristotle, every hour spent drilling with his companions, every battle fought across Asia Minor had led to this single point in time. The fate of two empires now hung in the balance, suspended like a sword over the heads of 100,000 warriors. As the Persian chariots thundered across the plain, their terrible blades spinning death with every revolution, Alexander's response was swift and decisive. Rather than meet them head-on, he ordered his light infantry forward. Achaemenid javelin throwers and Cretan archers, men who had learned their craft hunting in mountain valleys and island shores, spread out in loose formations. These were not the rigid phalanxes of citizen soldiers, but professionals who understood that survival depended on mobility and marksmanship. The first volley of javelins and arrows rose like a deadly cloud, arcing high before plunging down among the charging chariots. Horses screamed and stumbled, their drivers fighting desperately to maintain control as bronze points found their marks. Many chariots veered off course, their deadly momentum dissipated by the storm of missiles. Others simply collapsed as their teams were brought down, becoming obstacles rather than weapons. But this was merely the opening movement in Alexander's symphony of destruction. As the surviving chariots reached his main line, another element of his tactical genius revealed itself. The Macedonian phalanx, that seemingly solid wall of spears, suddenly opened like a flower blooming in reverse. Predetermined gaps appeared between the companies, channels through which the remaining chariots could pass harmlessly to the rear, where reserve troops waited to dispatch the isolated crews. Darius watched from his command position as his most fearsome weapons were neutralized with almost casual efficiency. The chariots that had broken Persian enemies for generations were being treated like a minor inconvenience by these Western barbarians. Yet the great king showed no sign of panic. This was only the beginning, and he still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The main Persian advance now began in earnest. The immortals stepped forward with measured precision, their golden spears catching the sunlight like a field of deadly wheat. Behind them came wave after wave of infantry, Median spearmen and Assyrian archers, Bactrian swordsmen and Sogdian javelin throwers. The sound of their approach was like the roar of an approaching storm, a rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. Alexander's response was to do something that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Instead of remaining in his strong defensive position, he ordered his entire army to advance obliquely, moving forward and to his right at an angle that would take him off the carefully prepared battlefield Darius had chosen. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity, one that exposed his smaller force to potential disaster if it failed. The Persian king immediately recognized the danger. If Alexander succeeded in drawing the battle onto rougher ground, it would negate much of the Persian advantage in cavalry and chariots. Darius ordered his left wing to wheel inward, attempting to catch the Macedonians in their movement and pin them against his center. What followed was a collision of such violence that the sound could be heard for miles. The Macedonian phalanx, still advancing at their oblique angle, crashed into the Persian left with the force of an avalanche. The 18-foot sarissas, held by men who had drilled together for years, punched through Persian shields and armor with deadly precision. The front ranks of the Persian formation simply disappeared, trampled underfoot or impaled on the forest of spear points. Yet the Persians were far from broken. Their numerical advantage began to tell as fresh formations moved up to replace the fallen. The immortals, showing why they had earned their fearsome reputation, held firm against the Macedonian assault. Their shorter spears and lighter armor made them more flexible in the melee, and their discipline was absolute. Step by step, they began to push back against Alexander's center. On the Persian right wing, Mazaeus, one of Darius's most capable generals, launched a massive cavalry assault against the Macedonian left. Thousands of Persian and allied horsemen swept forward like a breaking dam, their lances lowered, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. The Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion found themselves fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. For a moment, it seemed as though Darius's plan might succeed. The Persian center was holding. Their right wing was achieving local superiority, and their sheer numbers were beginning to tell. In the confusion and dust of battle, it became difficult for either side to maintain clear command and control. Individual units found themselves isolated, fighting desperately against superior numbers while hoping that their comrades elsewhere were faring better. But Alexander had been waiting for precisely this moment. As the Persian line became stretched and distorted by the fighting, gaps began to appear in their formation. The young king, mounted on his warhorse Bucephalus and surrounded by his companion cavalry, spotted the opening he had been seeking. It was there, just to the left of where Darius himself stood with the immortals, a weakness in the line caused by units being drawn off to support the flanks. Without hesitation, Alexander spurred Bucephalus forward, his lance leveled, his bronze armor blazing in the sun. Behind him came the flower of Macedonian nobility, men who had grown up with him in the palace at Pella, who had shared his dreams of conquest from the very beginning. They formed a wedge of steel and determination that punched through the Persian line like a spear thrust through silk. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Persian soldiers who had been fighting steadily suddenly found the enemy king himself bearing down on their position. Panic began to spread through the ranks as word passed that Alexander was cutting his way toward the great king himself. Units that had been holding firm moments before began to waver and break. Darius found himself in mortal danger for the second time in his confrontations with Alexander. The Macedonian wedge was driving straight toward his position, cutting down immortals and royal guards with ruthless efficiency. The great king's chariot, so imposing at the start of the battle, now became a liability, making him a visible target while limiting his mobility. The moment of decision had arrived. Darius could stand and fight, risking capture or death but maintaining the honor of his position, or he could retreat and live to fight another day. The choice would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Around the Persian king, his bodyguards fought with desperate courage, knowing that their lives and honor depended on protecting their sovereign. Yet they could see the tide of battle turning, could feel the momentum shifting irreversibly toward the Macedonians. The carefully planned battle was dissolving into chaos, and in chaos, Alexander thrived while conventional armies crumbled. The dust and din of combat had reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. This was no longer merely a battle between armies, but a cosmic struggle between order and ambition, between the established world and the vision of a young king who believed himself destined to reshape it entirely. As the dust swirled around the two kings, separated by mere yards but representing worlds apart, the decisive moment had arrived. Darius, seeing Alexander's wedge of cavalry carving through his elite guards like a blade through parchment, made the choice that would echo through history. The great king wheeled his chariot around and fled the battlefield, his purple cloak streaming behind him as he abandoned his army to save his own life. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Word of the king's flight spread through the Persian ranks faster than wildfire through dry grass. Units that had been holding firm against the Macedonian assault suddenly found their will to fight evaporating. What was the point of dying for a king who would not die for them? The carefully orchestrated formations began to dissolve as individual soldiers made their own calculations about survival versus honor. Alexander, still fighting at the tip of his wedge, sensed the change before he saw it. The resistance that had been so fierce moments before was crumbling. Persian nobles who had fought like lions were now looking over their shoulders for escape routes. The immortals, Those legendary warriors whose name had struck fear into enemies for generations were breaking ranks and streaming toward the rear. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Alexander faced a crucial decision. His instinct was to pursue Darius personally, to end this war once and for all by capturing the Persian king. But reports reached him that his left wing under Parmenion was in serious trouble. The old general was fighting for his life against Mazaeus and thousands of Persian cavalry. If that flank collapsed, the entire Macedonian army could be rolled up from behind. The choice Alexander made in that moment revealed the true measure of his greatness. Instead of pursuing personal glory and the capture of Darius, he turned his cavalry to rescue Parmenion and secure complete victory. By day's end, the Achaemenid Empire lay shattered on the plains of Gaugamela. Its two-century reign ended by the tactical brilliance and unshakable will of a 25-year-old king who had dared to dream of conquering the world.